Professor Keyu Jin is an associate professor of economics at the London School of Economics and the World Economic Forum Young Global Leader, as well as the celebrated author of the New China Playbook Beyond Socialism and Capitalism. She is a renowned advisor to some of the biggest banks and financial firms in the world, having consulted for the World Bank, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and advised the China Banking Regulatory Commission on fintech. Keyu, it is a real pleasure to have you here with us today. Thank you very much.
It's great to be with you, Brian. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I want to begin with a big picture question on methods. When reading commentaries and articles about the Chinese economy today, we often hear comments on how complex, apparently opaque, and seemingly unintelligible of certain decisions made by the government of that China possesses today. And these are the characteristics that are ascribed to it. What, in your view, are the best ways of getting to grips with and understanding how the Chinese economy actually works, especially for those who do not necessarily speak or read or have had experience in China?
This is probably an accurate description, first of all, and I would say that even for Chinese, it's very difficult to figure out exactly what's going on. It's also part of the culture as well, ambiguity and opaqueness, although I think that as the markets develop, as capital markets start to become more important, the experiences, at least in these very critical sectors like finance, transparency, communication, is absolutely critical. Now, the Chinese economy is difficult to understand for a number of reasons, not just because it's complex, but also because it defies conventional wisdom. And everything that we have learned about how economic development models should work or what makes successful economies have been kind of thrown out of the window by the Chinese success, given that it has grown the fastest for the longest period of time in history during a period where its various ranks and things like ease of doing business or rule of law have been quite a bit, bad and worse than even it is now, and still managed to not only grow and lift people out of poverty. I think that has been repeated so many times, but also to dominate leading edge technologies and create new industries and emerging strategic sectors like AI and renewables in a very short amount of time. I'm sure we'll get to that, Brian, but so that, I think, just first of all to say that it's a very different model, and if we always use the same lens or a unique lens to assess China, we're going to get it wrong. Of course, I think that people who are on the ground who come to visit China obviously understand China much better. They have a much better sense of the competition, entrepreneurship, everything, the fact that the markets really work very well, the consumers shop, firms innovate, and so forth, rather than the state-dominated, centralized economy that the Western media likes to depict as if it's an old dinosaur. They see something very vibrant and very new. But there is not so much of many studies or many intellectual frameworks that can summarize how the Chinese model works, how it differs from the Western canonical model, its advantages and its challenges from a relatively neutral point of view, and really use a lot of data. There's so much data, and that's another misunderstanding. People think that you can't use China's data because you can't trust it. Well, really, there is a big, many sources of micro level data, whether it's on firms or Chinese households, consumers, that are actually the most comprehensive in the world. They're not like GDP and inflation data, which might be subject to manipulation at the government level, but there's internet sources, surveys. There's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of fantastic scholarly work that has been done. And part of what I did in my book is to draw on everything that we have learned, but from really substantive research, and tell a story. Tell us, narrate a new story about how China works and provide that intellectual, systematic framework.
No, that's an incredibly helpful and astute sort of opener to the conversation today. And because what I want to sort of follow up on is a potential candidate for a narrative that so-called China watchers often use in observing China, including folks on the ground in the mainland as well, is the idea of a pendulum, So you often hear folks saying that, there are times when the Chinese state advances and the private economy shrinks, and then other times the economy advances in the private sector, so to speak, and in the state sort of falls back. And as a case of 国进民退, or alternatively 民进国退, so to speak. And ultimately, it is through this calibration where the pendulum swings to the right and then to the left. Again, I'm using the Chinese sort of terms of left and right here, as opposed to what we take to be, the sort of economic definitions of left wing and right wing in the West, so to speak, that ultimately produces in this uneasy but also forward-oriented, path that's charted and mapped by the Chinese state, at least in the contemporary era. But to what extent do you see this pendulum theory as valid? Is it a plausible framework, or is it just a caricature that folks often invoke as a rule of thumb because of the selective cherry picking of data points? Because frankly, I'd say there's perhaps more complexity to what has gone on and is going on in China than merely a pendulum in one direction or the other. So what do you make of that?
There's a lot of continuity if you look at the Chinese economy that is not characterized by any swings. Reforms on one sense, in some maybe it has slowed down, the pace is different, but the idea that reforms should continue and that change, improvement of the people's livelihoods, and continued climbing up the value chain, all these efforts have been pretty continuous. They haven't had major swings and changes in policy direction. But I'd say the pendulum swing, if there were a few, and I think there are a few, and it's not just left and right, it's in all angles, if you will, but there are some, and that's not unique to China. The swing between national security now and economic growth, back to security, now back to growth, more pragmatism now, is very much actually a common feature in many countries. Where the growth agenda, it's put on hold because this new government comes in, or a middle income country becomes richer and it starts to elect populist governments and they change direction. And then they figure out, oh no, actually it's the economy stupid, and they go back to the economy. And we see these pendulum swings a lot in other countries, actually more so than in China because of these elections and party changes. Whereas I think in China, there has been a lot more continuity. I think that what is more prominent in the recent years is a struggle, a tension, or a few of these tensions that might entail a bit of swing back and forth because we are unsure of what China's direction should be. And so, for example, the observation that Western style capitalism has many deep fallacies is a true one, that ones that the West would be the first to recognize. But how do you overcome these inequality issues, these unfairness of opportunities, a few people getting extremely rich and not sacrifice growth, right? Has any country figured out? I think maybe apart from Scandinavia, it's a very, very difficult thing to square when you want Bill Gates to innovate and you want Warren Buffett to invest, right? And so that is something that China wants to deal with, this inequality. But what is the cost? Similarly, big techs have their problems, and this is again a universal truth. But is tackling entrepreneurship or suppressing their incentives the right method? Maybe not, but there certainly needs to be more regulation, which we haven't seen in the West either. So some of the swing back and forth in the recent time reflects this kind of tension and trade-offs, and we don't like any of the outcomes that we've seen, whether it's its impact on capital markets or its impact on entrepreneurship. We also don't like the fact that there has been this massive explosive growth that was not fair, right? And so I think there has been some back and forth now, but coming back to recent times, I think now, practically speaking, economy is still now back front and center. But I believe in that scenario, there will be some, swinging back and forth between security, geopolitics, climate change, economics, and social issues.
No, I think what you highlighted there about security as this overarching consideration and has perhaps acquired greater salience and eminence, not just in the Chinese leadership's eyes, but also in the eyes of, or from the perspectives of, say, the American government. You see, you look at Biden, for instance, with all the talk about, this geostrategic competition, doubling down on national security and homeland security in America, and also, of course, in Europe, in a raft of other countries where increasingly geopolitics has indeed not just re-entered into the fray in a substantive way, but also become top of mind for many leaders. I do agree with you, Keyu, that this sort of pendulum, or you can call it calibration and trade-off exercise, it's not a China only or specific phenomenon by any means or measures. But turning now to what some folks might say is in fact a sort of China unique phenomenon, or so they claim. What I really appreciated about your book, The New China Playbook, is your ability to offer a political institutional account of how the Chinese economy works. You look at the incentives and also motivations of bureaucrats, of leaders, of the party machine per se, and you take a pretty phlegmatic and also systematic approach to the overarching question without romanticizing or demonizing the political economy. But the question I have here is, where do you see ideology, which is often invoked and portrayed to be a rather, distinctive facet of the Communist Party of China's leadership per se, especially as part of its claim to legitimacy? Where do you see ideology as playing a role in China's macroeconomics? Does it play a role, if at all? Or is it merely a sort of veil that's used to conceal, pretty practical, instrumentalist economic considerations?
I think in many ways it's a formality. What binds the nation together? There's obviously no dominant religion. People are not very religiosity, at least in internationally compared to internationally, is still low, although it's climbing. It can't be just materialistic pursuits. So what binds the nation together if you don't have India's social glue of people and festivals and all these traditions? So from the government's or leadership's perspective, there needs to be introduced to something, right? Whether we call that ideology or something that binds the nation together, a common struggle, a common goal. We hear that very often, and I think that a lot of it is political rather than something that people are steadfastly tied to. It's not a credence, if you will. And ideologies, I think we have thinkers in our leadership. We have leaders who want to create a vision, and if I were to say there is not an ideology, but something that contrasts very greatly with a U.S. moral universalism post-war, right? Spreading democratic values, liberal values. If you want to call that an ideology, it might also count as an ideology, but that's the goal. China's global view or world vision or ideology, if you want to call it, is a pragmatic development model that can raise living standards and raise human dignity, the dignity of living, right? The dignity to a better life, not just the values afforded of democracy and liberalism. I think that's China's contrasting worldview, if you don't want to call it ideology. So when you ask very specifically about something that is more domestic, I honestly don't see the younger generation, and definitely not the older generation, as being wedded to ideology per se, because of the historical experience that China has had about the dangers of ideology. And in that sense, as we mentioned from the previous question, when push comes to shove and the economy is being challenged and people's daily consideration is still overwhelmingly about putting food on their table or getting their kids educated or being able to afford a housing. My generation in the 1980s is called a housing generation. That's apparently our defining characteristics. It's overwhelmingly pragmatic. So I see that as more of a political, nominal thing to bind the nation together as a formality.
I was on the same panel as Rana Mitter, who stopped by Hong Kong just a couple of weeks ago, and he brought up this this question, really, of how history is employed in contemporary Chinese political parlance. And in his lecture, he referenced, the role played by Marxist-Leninism, Confucian and ancient classical Chinese philosophical ideals, a broad reliance and emphasis upon performance legitimacy, as well as, of course, the CPC's portrayal of both the revolutionary history undergirding, the run up to 1949, as well as, the early 20th or 19th to 20th century of humiliation when it comes to colonialism, imperialism, and all of these other sort of facets of China's troubled contemporary history at the hands of imperialists, colonizers, so on and so forth. But one point I raised subsequently, actually, was I think there's a fifth pillar to the equation, which is that China has historically seen itself through the lenses of economic statecraft. And that is the idea of employing and leveraging trade as a means of securing, prosperity, not just for itself, but also for its neighbors. And it's not because of altruism or the fact that the Chinese people are just a benign people. It's because it works economically. It's practical and pragmatic that if you can win hearts and minds without going to war, if you can win friends and make friends without, waging expensive battles and paying for incredibly exorbitant defense spending, for instance, maybe that's a better path to go with, really, than the alternative counterfactual. And I was just wondering, what you said just then about China's contrasting worldview to America and how it might offer, maybe an alternative, maybe some say a competing model, as I like to put it, a different model from the American way when it comes to the worldview. That is definitely a vision that we can see in the Chinese leadership. And yet, around vast swathes of the traditional West, there's a lot of fear, some of the fear manifesting in anxiety, vitriol, resentment. There's a generalized feeling that China is coming for them, that China is a sort of inexorably expansive and therefore threatening power. What exactly, in your view, Keyu, explains this discrepancy in perceptions, or this reading of China? I mean, it could be wrong, it could be valid, it could be right in some ways, but what, in your view, is driving this sort of China threat narrative that we often hear around the world today? And is there any credibility or credence to these narratives?
Well, first of all, China is not coming at them. Maybe that's their perception, but that's certainly not China's goal. China has quite a few other goals, such as we mentioned, improving the livelihoods of their people. Yes, even though poverty has been largely eliminated, there's a lot of room to go. And that relates to the fact, if I might be ever so controversial to say that, I think many of the rich countries forget what it is like to be poor. And they're just not that sensitive to poverty and to developing countries' needs. And this is not China's perspective. Just ask any of the BRIC countries and any of these, ASEAN countries. And even if you look around the world, and the vast majority of people still live in developing countries, what do they want, right? Even, coming back to Brexit, now at the risk of being completely sidetracked, but this is Oxford, Brexit pushed by many people who wouldn't really be hurt so much, the rich elites, but the costs fall on the common people, but they're not very sensitive to those people's needs anymore. But certainly you hear of this an urgent need and demand in the other parts of the world on having a say in the world orders. This is not about WTO or a conversation about the specifics, but they feel that the system has not accounted for their needs because they were designed by a handful of rich countries. And so when the West countries see this, rising developing nation, but coming at them at such a massive speed, high speed and scale, they feel threatened. But from China's perspective, this is development. This is economic improvement. This is everybody's livelihoods getting better. Now, my view is, if other countries like India, Vietnam, and whatever, the other developing nations in the region, and if they can make it this way, whatever model works, they should, right? They should not be concerned that they become a threat to the other nations. Now, of course, you can't constitute a threat because they're smaller, but India is a very large nation. If India can have a successful development model, and we're seeing some signs of it, I'm very positive that China's interpretation is not India's coming at them. Their interpretation would be, well, you know, India figured out its own way, and this gives us opportunities, but this will give us more competition. Now, when we talk about let's focus on the economics for a second, you know, on the EVs or the renewables. Yes, Chinese competition has completely thrown out a lot of the European competitors and producers. They will say it's subsidies. Well, I'm sorry, but no country subsidizes its way to success, right, at a consistent level. And by the way, the subsidies aren't really relevant anymore. It's true that initially these subsidies might have helped jumpstart the industry, and they were big. Let's not kid ourselves, but some of them were successful, some of them were not successful. We can get into that later. But the fact is, ultimately, they resulted in the most cutthroat competition. And it's not as if Chinese companies are subsidized and are not good. They are actually excellent when it comes to EVs or renewables, and they are competing with these countries. So it doesn't feel great on the other side, but this is a country rapidly rising. So I think that if you ask China what its own goals are, the first is, as we mentioned, some of these economic priorities, becoming a rich nation by a certain amount of time. Of course, they have more ambitions to influence the global monetary, financial, trading architecture, geopolitically, have more power in the region. Now, I'm not an expert in this, you guys are, but yeah, these are certainly part of the agenda, but it's not about spreading the model. It's not about spreading Chinese values, certainly not. But I think its view is, look, you know, China has done pretty well in terms of development. Can we share some of these lessons?
Absolutely. And I think one point you raised just then, which I find particularly interesting, is you mentioned, you know, the rise of India, and I add, of course, the rise of other countries in BRICS with Brazil, and of course, South Africa. And even in terms of Southeast Asian nations engaging in multi-alignment, it does strike me that this is an era where the conventional G7 playbook, if I may use that very same word, no longer seems to be the only path that's plausible or possible. And moreover, you know, what's worth noting for both Chinese and also the world at large, the commentators, so to speak, is that the global south is a heterogeneous cluster of countries that have differing preferences, have differing interests, and have to ultimately cater to their own peoples, which is why even a country that as favorable as it is to China, like Brazil, has recently launched its own probe into sort of Chinese EVs, so to speak, not because it's anti-China, but because naturally speaking, there's an economic or a competition logic undergirding this all. And I think it's imperative, you know, for observers of the new shifts to the global order to recognize that the global south and the global north have their own sort of differences and disunities, and to speak of them as to speak of them as one or two monoliths or two blocks, you know, grappling or wrestling with one another is perhaps an oversimplification of the picture. But I want to now turn to the state of the Chinese economy today, just following on from what we've been discussing for the past few questions. And the specific point that I want to home in on concerns the state of total factor productivity and TFP growth in China over the past 3 decades. Now, according to the IMF, Chinese TFP rose by around 22% in total between 2003 and 2011. And this decreased as a number to only 5% between 2011 and 2019, with an equally steady decline in the contribution to GDP growth by TFP growth. So you had 3.9% in 1995, and in you know, between 1995 and 2007, declining to 1.9% between 2017 and 2021. So I was just wondering, Keyu, what do you think explains the challenges that China has on improving TFP, and what exactly are the remedies to these challenges?
Well, first of all, in the previous decades that you mentioned, a lot of the productivity growth, TFP growth, has come from a reallocation of resources to more efficient levels. So in other words, reducing misallocation. Now, if we remember something like 400 million workers moving from agriculture to industry, from state to private enterprises, and also capital. that dramatically reduced the misallocation of capital across sectors and across firms. And so a lot of the growth in that earlier period was due to just simply reorganizing, shifting resources around. We usually think about productivity growth as if it's predominantly driven by innovation or these really important, technological breakthroughs. Well, in fact, most developing countries don't have that, but their productivity growth improves a lot from misallocation issues. Now, in terms of productivity growth, slowdown in the last decade, it also has a lot to do with let's say increasing misallocation, or at least a reduction in the the degree of in the growth of reducing misallocation. So part of the reason is after 2009, with a big stimulus, it was a credit-driven cycle, and a lot of it went to SOEs, a lot of it went into the real estate, a lot of it went into shadow banking, places which is not inherently productive and fundamentally important, but which are large, and there were incentives to do so. It's true that China has really improved on its innovation capacity and had seen huge investments in high-tech sectors, but we're not going to see it in the productivity numbers, just like we don't see it in the productivity numbers in the US or Europe either. Maybe it's measurement issues, but maybe it is that these kind of investment, when they actually realize into the macro figures, it really takes a long period of time. So there have been huge investments, but we haven't seen these numbers so far. And so continued productivity, this comes back to a fundamental issue about the Chinese economy. In my mind, the financial system is at the very core of some of the recent problems, or at least it exacerbates some of the challenges and maybe even the downturn. And this is why I come back to this issue of tension or trade-off when I started our conversation. Yes, China didn't like the financially driven credit cycle investment growth cycle after 2009. By the way, the West has criticized China repeatedly for an unsustainable credit boom. But the fact of the matter is, I think it's gone a little bit overreacted. There's now a credit crunch. There's not enough financial liquidity and credit among Chinese companies. And who suffers the most because of it? It's the private firms, the small, medium-sized enterprises, because the SOEs are still well capitalized and the banks want to lend to them. So in some sense, the credit boom wasn't that bad of a thing, because at least some of it went into this, smaller companies and private sector, and they had liquidity, they could grow and it could expand. Now there's a paralysis almost in the financial system. So coming back to the situation right now, the pandemic, which lasted a very long time. There was no $5 trillion stimulus package as it was in the US. No households got really these kind of support system. And then you're forcing a real estate transition from a decade into 3 years, not to mention a series of other incentive issues and confidence issues. Then you have a downturn cycle. But should we interpret that as a permanent thing? I don't think so.
On that, actually, we've seen evidence, right, that the state has been pretty proactive in, dealing with the overinflated real estate bubble by pursuing deleveraging measures. Some might say that the 3 red lines were too abrupt, others would say they were a necessary evil in order to bring, or to signal very clearly through this sprawling bureaucracy, especially to the folks, in the local governments and the municipal governments, that the music has stopped and it's time to call it a day when it comes to sort of the 无序扩张 of capital, the disorderly expansion of capital. And yet, on the other problem you mentioned just then, which is SOEs and inefficiency, I mean, it's a long-standing problem, right? The idea that you have state-owned enterprises that have, understandably, a different set of incentives. Some might say they are more politically accountable to the party, to the government, to the state. Others would say they're not aligned with profit maximization, or more specifically, efficiency improving. Yet what exactly are the solutions to SOE inefficiencies? I mean, is the answer to bring back and to reinflate the sentiments of the private sector, or is it really about undertaking structural reforms within SOEs and to try and fix the problem from the ground up, as opposed to shifting to another arena or track? What do you think is the answer to the challenges there in SOEs, Keyu?
Look, SOEs have greater responsibilities than just profit maximization. There are social responsibilities. During the pandemic, they have to come out. If China wants to build a stadium or do, Olympics or whatever it is, they have to bear the brunt of the responsibility. And if they have to undertake security measures, that's, it's up to them. I think the right way is to keep them kind of their influence at a bare minimum, if you will, in some of the strategic sectors, certainly trying to prevent a crowding out effect of private companies, especially in very competitive sectors like manufacturing, like innovation. The good news is that the state has made it very clear that SOEs will play a very minimal role going forward, as well as the state, in the innovation agenda. Whereas SOEs used to, in the first crop of the technology strategies, were tasked, were burdened with the task of undertaking national innovation. Now they totally have stepped aside and saying it's up to the private sector. I think that, where there's some strategic ways that there will be SOE influence. And by the way, this is, again, not a unique phenomenon. If we look at France, right, if we look at some other European countries and also Brazil and India, of course, there are also very important state-owned enterprises. I still want to come back to the issue of finance. Now, finance, despite what we think about it, is really like the blood in our body, right? You have various organs, but it really delivers the oxygen to the entire body. And I want to emphasize that because it is the financial system where it's most apparent that there's discrimination between the state and the private. And it's not an active, explicit discrimination. It's an implicit institutional one, which is the financial system, which have many layers. The first layer is something like, I don't know, 16 financial institutions, and then hundreds of financial institutions. They have a whitelist as to who they can lend to, who they can, work with. And it's all SOEs because they don't want to take the risk. They don't want to be held accountable if something goes wrong. And so it doesn't come back to the real sector. And when it does, it's double-digit cost of capital. It's significantly multiples higher than the SOEs. So again, it's maybe not, it's the institution's problem constraints that are making the state benefit more rather than a direct, kind of government imposition. I think that part we have to be very clear about. And if we look observing the Chinese economy now, it's very, very clear. The SOEs are fine, despite everything. The private sector is not fine, and it's mostly a liquidity credit issue. And especially in downturns, no banks want to lend to private firms. But this is exactly the opposite of counter-cyclical macro policy, right? It's when things are not going well that there's enough liquidity and credit. But in China, it's the opposite.
And I would also add, I guess, we've talked a lot about the firms, the private versus state divide. And of course, the debates that come to my mind include the one that took place in a series of op-eds and commentaries in 2016 between Lin Yifu, Justin Lin, and also Zhang Weiying. That there was a lot of contention over, whether not top-down industrial policies, state-driven intervention, or propping up of champions in the context of innovation was the way to go. And I guess, in some ways, what you said just then really alludes to this perennial debate that has gone on and raged on in China since 1978. And to folks who say that there's no debate amongst policymakers and academics in China, I would encourage them to look to, not just the works of Lin Yifu, Li Daokui, or indeed Zhang Weiying, but of course yourself, and going back to Li Yiniang and many others who have really commented on this issue of state industrial policy and grappled with its implications. And if I may, just to play devil's advocate here, I would say, in spheres such as semiconductors, lithium batteries, electric vehicles, perhaps less so because of the presence of private firms, it does strike me that state subsidies have been crucial and pivotal, and as you said, kickstarting a lot of the sort of initial R&D, the blue sky research, and overcoming the overheads involved. But as it transitions, as the economy and the sector transitions to the next phase of development, so to speak, what you were suggesting just then, Keyu, seems to be that there's a need for a different approach, a different sort of rule book or playbook, so to speak. Could you perhaps elaborate on what you mean here by the recalibration of the equilibrium, if you see that to be necessary in the first place?
Absolutely. The old playbook was great for industrialization. It was good for urbanization, like developing real estate. But innovation is a completely different thing. You can copy a lot of stuff, right? Making goods. You can't copy institutions, and you can't copy, a governance and rule of law and all that very easily. But innovation and all the creativity, the flow of exchange that's required is an entirely different model. But let me come back to that. But when I go around the world and I speak to lots of governments, especially the ones that want to get things started, the first thing they ask is, it's a chicken and egg problem. How do you get investment and talent in if you don't even have the industry? So it's, jump starting the ecosystem, jump starting a new industry requires a certain degree of state mobilization, unless you're like the West and you have 100 years really to perfect that capital markets and that mature markets. Well, most developing countries don't have that kind of luxury of time. And the biggest question is, how do you jumpstart it? Right now, if Chinese government, the playbook or the model, which I described very much in detail in the book, the mayor economy, where the mayors helped entrepreneurs overcome these barriers, helped them get loans, helped them build supply chains, gave them cheap real estate, and helped them attract talent, and built stuff like an EV sector and a lithium battery sector. I put semiconductors in a different camp because that's more about catching up than starting new sectors. It's incontrovertible that they were very successful. I'll bring you some data points in just a second, but the idea that it wasn't just financial subsidies, it was a lot about coordination and mobilization. Now, that is completely missing in our canonical economic models. There's no role of the state in terms of coordination or mobilization. But the truth is, they helped build an entire supply chain. They matched suppliers and buyers and did all that. And and there was investment, but it was not just financial subsidies alone that mattered so much. So the case studies that I want to mention, and I struggle with this, to be honest, Brian. I'm not trying to say that China has a perfect model, because it certainly doesn't. It's very much a double-edged sword. And let me try to explicate and explain this. So solar and EVs. If you look at a map of 2005, in 2005, China was a desert when it came to EVs or solar. There's nothing, no production, no innovation, patents or whatever. Since 2005, solar costs have reduced by something like 95%. Between 2005 and 2013, Chinese solar producers were increasing production by 76% annually, and they became the leaders of innovation and patents, leading frontier. So if you look at a map in 2013 or 2015 of the innovation patents in China, thousands, many cities had thousands every year. They were scattered all over China. It was up to the local governments to implement this. So this comes back to my characterization of the political centralized, economically decentralized model. It's not as if the central government decided on everything. It's really very decentralized, and it was up to the government to do a good job. And then if you look at EVs, I'm not going to repeat how successful that was. If you just measure it by production and innovation point of view, it's incontrovertible that that development model was at the core of this. Now, on the other hand, the benefits are there, but it's very difficult to estimate the cost, right? The cost of the subsidies, but also the inefficiencies. Does China really need 80 cities all doing EVs and hundreds of EV brands? Absolutely not, right? And the kind of capacity that it has increased, I think that has totally sped up the whole development, but there were certainly costs behind it. But on net, I still believe the benefits outweighed the cost, because China was never able to produce its own combustion engine vehicle, but in new sectors, it was able to succeed and has drawn down the cost. So in that sense, I think these kind of state models, we should really assess it with a more clear-eyed perspective.
I think I've raised the following point to you before previously, but I just want to, pick up on what you said about the mayor economy and also the political versus economics of centralization versus decentralization cut, so to speak, which I certainly think is a very, emphatic and interesting theory, both of them. But the question I have here is, to what extent do you think the scope of freedom of discretionary powers by the mayor, ebbs and flows in accordance with decisions undertaken by the center. And the reason why I asked that is, of course, if you recall, criticism that was off-levied towards the Hu and Wen administration around 15 years ago is that during the period of time, there's a tendency for their orders to be stuck in Zhongnanhai, 就是正令不出中南海. And that was a problem that was often, alleged because of their emphatic emphasis upon devolving powers to the governors and the secretaries and then governors of provinces, of cities, and of course of local governments as well. So precisely because of the political decentralization that they pursued, it was alleged in retrospect what had occurred was impunity, a pandemic of impunity when it came to lower level officials engaging in actions that were, whilst not necessarily explicitly against a mandate from the center, certainly not aligned with national interest. And much of that has changed over recent years. We've seen, an increasing focus and orientation on centralization, more alignment between the center and localities, mayors, and and beyond that, of course, the secretaries of the cities, secretaries of the provinces, and the respective corresponding counterparts in the Politburo and the Central Committee as well. To what extent, then, do you think the mayor economy has perhaps transitioned into a more centrally oriented economy over the past 10 years, or do you still see the enduring relevance of the hypothesis, I suppose, especially in coastal cities and large cities, directly administered cities, Shanghai, Beijing, Chongqing, and Tianjin, but also, I guess, in other cities as well, where mayors and, of course, the secretaries certainly happen to have a lot of influence over decision making. And I guess a follow-up question, by the way, if you have time on that front, is why mayor and not party secretary? Because as we all know, the number one in cities is the secretary, and the number two is the mayor. Is there a reason why you chose mayor as opposed to party sec as a way of terming or labeling your theory?
I'll start with the second question, which is the easiest. Mayor economy, because it sounds almost identical to market economy, ironically, in Chinese, 市场经济 and 市长经济. So that's why the mayor economy was a kind of a character of the situation. But of course, as you rightly said, it's really the local government, right? Leaders, provincial governors, secretaries, party secretaries, and also the mayor also has a huge amount of influence. It's all of them collectively, but it's kind of the same thing. Sorry, it's the same thing. But the truth is, the relationship between the center and the localities have always been a historical challenge. This is not going away. If we think that somehow China has a one-man show and everybody listens to one person or just a few people and they follow strict orders, you are totally getting China wrong. The complexity of the issue and why there's so many challenging management issues is precisely the fact that lots of these mayors are CEOs in their own right, and they have their own incentives, and they will look at the orders and say, well, look, we might not want to implement that. They're not going to say it that way, but if it's not aligned with their incentives, they're going to find all kinds of excuses not to do them. And so it's always been the case, even in real estate, even in the environmental sector. I mean, for years and years, they were tasked with bringing down, addressing the environmental problems. And for years, they just did not follow orders until there were some strict, very rigorous, rigid penalties and strict enforcement. It's always been a struggle. And so that also means that they still have a lot of power. The devolved power is very, very important. If you look at the local entrepreneurs, they deal with the local governments. The local banks deal with the local governments. Tax policies, land policies, all of that is with the local governments. So yes, even though we've seen more political centralization, I think the economic models haven't really changed that much, also because institutionally, it's actually impossible to implement everything that the central government wants at the local level when your antenna, the stretch is through the local governments to implement these things. And that actually has been the biggest struggle, mostly manifested through, more recently manifested through the huge explosion in local government debt. right? And why are they not resolving it easily by just writing them off or, transferring them fiscal resources from the central coffers? Well, it's moral hazard, and it's a very real one in the sense that local government will just want to spend because they want to create their, local dynamism. And they can be irresponsibly doing that because they'll either be, not in power or, who knows what they're doing, but you can see very good GDP numbers. And the central government doesn't want to encourage that. So I don't think it's as simple as this model no longer works. Now, the who and when era was a time when it kind of got out of control, the degree of, let's say, corrosive linkages between businesses and local governments. It was just festering. And President Xi came in and wanted to address this. And I think by and large, the local government corruption has been curbed to a great extent. And a side remark is that if you look at the Weibo or social media, I think an international survey paper based on international survey has shown that almost a third of the social media threads have to do with criticizing local governments and local government corruption issues. It's not something that they don't want to tackle.
And a point that you highlighted there briefly too is the idea of disparities between cities and regions and provinces in particular. And Chinese analysts, or indeed many in America themselves, pundits, columnists, they often comment on the state of socioeconomic inequality and wealth disparity in the West, especially in the US, for instance. When it comes to China, I was drawn to Scott Rozelle and Natalie Hell's Invisible China, which was published around 4 years ago, a book that examined the rural-urban gap and disparities in China, as well as both the progress and the bottlenecks, that China has when it comes to ameliorating regional inequalities, and especially the rural-urban gaps and the inland and coastal provincial gaps, so to speak. What do you see to be the most urgent remedies for such disparities?
The massive rural-urban gap, where there's a significant, maybe almost a billion, at least hundreds of millions of undereducated and underemployed rural workers. Again, is a challenge, but it's an opportunity. And if you can spread out some of the social infrastructure, access to healthcare, access to education, the proper kind of education, like vocational training, the technical skill training that China really needs, that of course is very important. So number one, human capital. Hukou system is of course very, very important because it restricts migration flows, but also talent flows. And even a place like India would have more intra-regional migration flows than China, although the numbers are not small. But it's really also about social protection, right? You have 176 million migrant workers who almost have the same level of income as an urban worker, as an equivalent urban worker, but they would spend a third as much as an urban worker. Why? Because they don't have the proper social security protection and access to many things. And there's also local protectionism, right? This is coming back to the downsides of our mayor economy model, where every mayor wants to protect their own local champions, and they restrict trade flows. If you are a successful truck maker in northern provinces, I'm not going to have you come and sell in my southern province because I want to promote my own. And obviously that's a big problem because this is totally against internal trade, right? And internal trade in China is very, very large. Many of the provinces trade much more with Chinese provinces than they trade with other countries. And if you have these barriers to trade flows, it's also a damper on productivity. But most importantly, the geographical disparity is also a political economy issue. But I think that there's also a lot of new exciting projects to developed that could potentially to sort of mitigate this. So for instance, the Western Front, which is the poorest regions in China, now lots of data centers, processing centers are put there, new energy sectors, and so forth. But I think that it has a lot to do with the mayor model to explain the geographical disparity.
It strikes me that the western regions of China are certainly rapidly rising, not just in terms of economic growth, but also in terms of human capital and talent. Whereas a region that I've often heard as being left behind, they're kind of like the Rust Belt of China, is Dongbei, so the northeast, so to speak, and they're having issues there, sort of with adjusting to an increasingly knowledge-intensive and I suppose sort of mechanized and automated economic zeitgeist that we see today. And on that note, though, I do want to turn to, having mentioned Rust Belt, to the other country on the other side of the pond, so to speak, which is America and the Sino-American relationship. Now, Keyu, you're really quite remarkable in your own personal story. You've studied in the US at one of the world's foremost academic institutions. You have served and also advised of the leading financial institutions in the West, and you understand economics across both East and West with an almost unrivaled level of first-hand experience and insights. And yet, as it stands, it strikes me that the kind of exchanges, the dialogues, the frank and also in-depth exposure and immersion that you've had, and I guess to some extent I've had, it's getting increasingly difficult thanks to geopolitical tensions, thanks to securitization, and of course this sort of almost unbridledly acerbic rhetoric that we often hear from America in particular concerning the rise of China. And I suppose you can also point to nationalists in China, but I would say they have far less sway over governmental policies. So the question I have for you is, given all of this, what can we do to keep exchanges alive and to keep conversations happening on a more human level?
Well, I think what you pointed out is the most critical part about it, right? The state does not need to see eye to eye and on all issues. But I think that when it comes to China and the US and Chinese people and the Americans, they actually have a lot more common, from at least my experience, than what is depicted. The love for competition and ambition. If you look at Chinese and American businessmen, when it works the best. And there have been many, many successful combinations and marriages in China and the US as well. And I certainly don't think it's a civilizational issues. I mean, if there were to be one, it's always been around, right? That has not changed. But it is probably a competition issue. It's probably a rivalry issue. It's probably a lot of it is a miscommunication issue, and there you can blame both sides for the poor job that they have done. But it's especially sad to see that the person-to-person exchanges have also been diminished, not to mention the collaborative efforts of scientists and research. I mean, think about medicine, right? Biotech and all these really important things in technology and data that the two countries can do together to overcome these super important transnational challenges. How much of that is being forsaken just because of the geopolitical backdrop is really sad. And of course, the climate change issue that I don't need to mention these. And by the way, the next time that the global financial crisis comes around the corner, and there certainly will be one, there's no way that these two central banks are not going to talk to each other, right? There's no way that the US is not going to ask China to support support liquidity in certain countries and so forth. So I think that now you're seeing a lot of Chinese students and this is again maybe perception, but perception turns into reality, that they don't want to go to the US to study anymore because of racism or because of discrimination, or at least perceived. It is true that visas are more difficult to obtain for Chinese students, something like 22% drop in Chinese student visas or applications since 2019. These are really major numbers. Now, coming from somebody who has benefited hugely from the best time, the golden era of the two countries. In 1997, I got a full scholarship to go to high school in the US and then subsequently university and graduate school. It's very, very dispiriting to see. It's very sad, very frustrating to see, because I think the two countries have a lot more potential. But we're actually, there's a period of emotional, sentimental reactions, and that was very much true during the pandemic. I think now over time, people have calmed down a little bit, and they've started to talk about how bad the relation is and how sad it is that it's so bad. And I hear a lot more Americans reminiscing the days where they would go and visit China, and China was really on the rise and really eager learner. I mean, really eager learner of the American ways, American way of life. And so I think that there's a slight return to more pragmatic and rational approach, even though, you know, the temperature might be down a little bit, the weather has not changed. But at least from the new generation, and this is the big theme in my book, you know, the new generation is China's big hope because their values are much more similar with the Gen Zs of the rest of the world in terms of the consideration they have for animal rights, social rights, climate, environment, equity issues are very much the same kind of values, and the challenges are also same with American new generation. We just cannot plant. It would be so irresponsible to plant a dangerous idea in their heads that somehow one is pitted against the other, and that one has to, you know, beat the other or you know, kind of and go in separate ways. That is a very dangerous idea to plant into the minds of the young if we're talking about, you know, world peace and a better life for all.
I wholeheartedly concur with you, and indeed I argued in a piece myself around 2 years ago that Gen Z is our best hope of repairing, you know, Sino-American relations, precisely because of the value compatibility and also the interest convergence. The fact that we're all ultimately co-inhabitants on this planet that is susceptible to climate change, but also the risks posed by unbridled development of artificial intelligence, pandemics, and also other potentially existential risks as well. As we come up to the end of this conversation, though, which has been so fun and also engaging, Keyu, I do have you know, one or two more personal questions for you, if you will. And the first one is that you've spoken and argued extensively that individuals the world over should take a more nuanced position on China, that there needs to be fewer misunderstandings and greater communication and dialogue. And I genuinely agree with you on that front. But here's a devil's advocate response, and that is perhaps it's precisely because at least the US political establishment, per se, understands the fundamental challenge to its dominant status, the sort of hegemonic status it accomplished at the end of the Cold War over the past 30 odd years, that's posed by China's rise. And that symmetrically, Beijing recognizes that the US is unlikely, or at least the political establishment is unlikely to yield to an ascendant economy that presents such a different or distinct set of institutions as you've outlined in your book yourself. Then maybe it's the case that the two sides in the leaders understand one another too well. So it's not a case of not enough understanding or misunderstanding, but that they are too well versed with one another's potential strategic implications than for actual coexistence, which is in the interest of the peoples, to materialize. What do you make of this argument or hypothesis?
Well, if you listen to some of the congressional hearings on China-related issues, I don't think I'm convinced that they know China too well. And if I argue the opposite side, I think the Chinese view that the only goal that the US has is to hold China down is also too black and white a view. I think there are a lot of things that can improve the situation, and nobody is stupid enough to want a collision that will really, you know, kill large numbers of people and harm both countries. I think that bit is clear. So how to manage the relationship is absolutely crucial. And I do think that that relies on better communication, including things like small victories, working on fentanyl you know, restrictions or a bunch of global projects. If the US could better appreciate that China's cultural backdrop is our relationship with authority is just fundamentally different from theirs, and maybe the Chinese people don't want the same things all the time as the Americans, appreciate that, then you know, there's at least less of an emotional kind of you know, attitude or approach or conflict towards China, or antagonism towards China. So no, it doesn't fundamentally change the challenging situation, and it's a very difficult to resolve issue to resolve. There's no resolution, but it has to be managed, right? And I think that is where both sides agree. But how to manage it and whether that's effective will depend on a much deeper understanding, but also what I emphasize in my book, multiple lenses, multiple perspectives, and having an open mind enough to recognize that there is such a thing.
the final question I have for you today is that folks who advocate positions, such as ours, such as the way we look at the world and also Sino-American relationship, we often get a lot of flack and opprobrium from all sides, especially from pretty, I guess, sternly and stiffly, convinced individuals who have made up their mind before even listening to us. They sort of think they're always right. And as you said, if you look at congressmen, but also many of the advisors, many of the workers, the staffers, the kind of senior aides who had the ears and will, touch wood, maybe not, but will have the ears of future presidents, for instance, they seem to have an incredibly diminutive, essentialist, and also, I would say, almost dangerously simplistic understanding of China, so to speak. And yet you've spoken at many conferences, panels, events alongside them. Sometimes you've spoken against them in debates, other times alongside them in panels, including the most recent one, of course, where you were at Aspen. And that was a very interesting panel that I watched and enjoyed watching. How do you feel when you're speaking in context like that? What is the sort of emotive state that you're in, and how do you cope with the kind of I don't know about you, but a potential sort of sense of fuming, the inner fuming that you get from having to explain what is pretty straightforward and true in a way that gets attacked almost groundlessly by many of those who are present and who ask questions that are rooted in more speculation than facts. What do you make of all of this?
Well, there's a book that Tony Judd wrote called When the Facts Change, right? And so usually when the facts change, your opinions should change as well. But that's often not the case. Even when the facts change, you still are wedded to your own opinion. And that I have much less patience for. Even my own views about the Chinese economy has changed as the facts have changed as well. And I've come to recognize that for all the expediency that it has in certain periods of time and certain development stages, it could be more harm than an enabler in other times. And so, as being as intellectually honest as possible, at least from the economist's point of view, we are more rigorously kind of evaluated based on statistics and data. You got to have that flexibility to change some of the views. The personal feeling I have is I'm often pushed into the position of having to defend China, not because those are the most important views I want to get across, but because it's just so radically wrong, what they're saying about China and the consistent negativity around China when it's been a country that has had incontrovertible successes in other ways. And I'm sure that other countries have similar experiences. So do I really want to be on the panel of arguing for China? No, not necessarily the position I want to have, but to balance out the debate. Otherwise, another side of kind of just being in our own world and not seeing reality, then I'm pushed into the position. There are a lot of basic questions. You're right, but again, this is. If you take a very solely, especially American lens to look at things, you see a lot of things wrong with the issues. But if I use my Chinese lens to look at America, then similarly, that would be the case. So what you do, how I feel is yes, I'm a little bit outraged sometimes that I have to be in that kind of position, whereas my position is much more, I feel like I see the good and I see the bad and I see the future rather than I just see the good. But there are also challenging things for China, right? Very, very hard to answer some of these in the international spectrum. So that just leaves all of us to do our bit of the job.
Thank you so much for your time, Keyu. I'm sure for those of you at home, and this hopefully has been an enjoyable conversation, I certainly thoroughly enjoyed it. And it was a real pleasure and privilege being joined by Keyu today. So thank you very, very much. Thank you.